Good evening and welcome to our panel discussion organized by the Foreign Policy Center as a part of its Unsafe for Scrutiny series with support by the Justice for Journalists Foundation. My name is Lana Istimirova. I'm the producer and the host of Trouble with the Truth podcast and the FPC Fellow. I will be your chair tonight. As you may know, 2nd of November marks International Day for Ending Impunity Against Crimes Against Journalists. And this sort of impunity affects us all because impunity breeds impunity. And just recently we had the anniversary of Anna Politkovskaya murder in Russia that still hasn't been solved. But that doesn't just affect regions such as Russia and Mexico. It's actually closer to us than we think, because just only recently on 14th of October, we've reached another sad anniversary, 4 years since the murder of brave and talented journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. Thanks to the relentless pursuit of justice by Daphne's family, colleagues, and dedicated campaigners, there have been a number of breakthroughs in the case and the murder investigation. And currently 3 people are awaiting trial connected with the murder. But nonetheless, the corruption and backroom deals that Daphne exposed in her articles still exist in Malta today. And those journalists and activists who continue her mission also face repercussions: physical threats, online harassment, legal intimidation, just to name a few. And one of the most insidious methods of silencing independent voices are SLAPPs, strategic lawsuits against public participations, and we'll talk about them in more detail. And so today, with the help of our fantastic speakers, we'll explore all this in more detail. So just a couple of things. We also have a consecutive Russian translation. I'll just say it in Russian quickly for those who perhaps don't speak English. Вы можете выбрать опции русского перевода, которые рядом с Q&A. Просто нажмите на кнопку и выберите нужный вам язык. Okay, so that's sorted. And once we get to the Q&A, please make sure you type in the question into a separate Q&A section and not into the chat, and then we'll be able to answer your questions. So back to the speakers. We have Paul Caruana Galizia, Daphne's son, a journalist and a co-founder of Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation. Paul has been tirelessly campaigning alongside his brothers and other family members to bring his mother's murderers to justice and end corruption in Malta. Thank you so much for joining us. And there's also wonderful Caroline Muscat, an award-winning journalist and the founder of Shift News, a Maltese investigative media outlet that carries on Daphne's legacy. And she's a very humble person, but just like Daphne, she has received her fair share of threats and harassment campaigns, and she'll tell us more about the state of media freedom in Malta and what challenges independent journalists face today. Next, we have Rebecca Vincent, Director of International Campaigns in Reporters Without Borders. She's been in and out of Malta for the last few years and has been campaigning nonstop to get justice for Daphne and to ensure that journalists can carry on doing their work without fear. And then finally, we have Keelan Gallagher, QC, barrister at Doughty Street Chambers. She's been leading the legal team that represents Daphne's family and knows everything about the case. Keelan is one of the most prominent experts in media law and has dedicated her career to defending press freedom and human rights worldwide. It's such an honor to be a part of this esteemed panel of speakers, and I'll just briefly walk you through our event. So each of the speakers is going to have a few minutes to talk about their topic, and then after that, the floor will be open to your questions. So without further ado, if Paul could begin.
Hey, so thank you so much for hosting. Like you said, Lana, there have been a couple of breakthroughs in my mother's case over the past, now unbelievably to think, 4 years. But it's strange because it feels like at once a lot has happened, but really nothing has happened, because a lot of the corruption, again, like you said, has gone on unprosecuted. We're still in a mixture of pre-trial proceedings, waiting for jury trials, and it's it's been a long 4 years. I think Caroline is much more able to talk about the threats journalists in Malta are facing now, because she obviously works there and is really up against a lot of those same forces. But maybe it's helpful if I talked about the threats my mother faced, and in a way is still facing. So she was sued countless times over her career. Things really escalated after 2013. So after 2013, it became very apparent that the courts were being used really just to harass her. So famously, one Maltese oligarch filed 19 libel suits against her over the same article. And I don't know if people know this, but in Malta, you need to pay court fees to file a response. So my mother had to pay 7,000 euros just to file a response to each one of those suits. That's on top of her legal fees, the time she spends in court preparing for the suits themselves. And she got more and more of those suits, so that by the time she was killed, she was facing close to 50, a number of which were criminal libel suits, which have now been outlawed. And those suits under Maltese law continued against us as her heirs. So a lot of her time, in fact, the first time my brothers and I left the house together was to attend a hearing in a suit that the former economy minister filed against my mother. And we've now fought, and this goes to show just how they're intended to harass and do little else. We fought down almost all those suits now. 4 years later, we're facing 4, including one by the former prime minister. And I don't know, I can't continue, Lana, but I know we have 5 minutes each. So perhaps.
I'm sure you can carry on, of course, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Don't worry, you have time.
I have time. Okay. Anyway, so the case shows how the courts really just became part or an extension of the harassment campaign against her, and really in a really intensive way, so that there were entire days where she was doing nothing but responding to these threats. Then there was a qualitatively different part of this harassment campaign when, over the same period, my mother realized too late that she was reporting against globalized corruption, so that the subjects of her writing had access to lawyers outside Malta, to other forms of harassment. So, for example, when she began reporting on the private firm that had a monopoly over Malta's cash for passport scheme, she began receiving threatening letters from Mishcon Darea in London that threatened legal action in England for articles she wrote about Malta in Malta. She got similar letters from 2 hideously corrupt Maltese politicians, Keith Cambria and Conrad Mitzi, who had instructed Shillings, so a really notorious firm of defamation lawyers who'll take anyone on as a client. And their behavior was so abusive that, in a way, the letters started, of course, they frightened my mother, the prospects of facing costs like the ones they threatened, but they became increasingly ridiculous. They always follow the same bullying format, pages and pages long. They come on Friday evening, they threaten this and that, to the point where 2 of those letters from Shillings entered into evidence in the public inquiry into her assassination, in part because there was no way these politicians could have afforded the legal fees shillings charged. But anyway, I say this to show how these lawyers, how courts in Malta and elsewhere are being abused in this way, and still are in Malta.
Thank you for sharing this with us, Paul, and we'll be able to talk about it in more detail during the Q&A. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Yes, as Paul said, in 4 years, it seems like a lot has happened and nothing much at all, in the sense that there has been a tremendous movement, both nationally and internationally, to address the situation in Malta. It is true, the pressure created with the support that we have managed to push the need for certain reforms forward. But the processes in Malta, the rule of law in Malta remains what it is, and in that sense, it is sick. The Council of Europe only today issued a statement that referred to the public inquiry findings, and said and called for the need for deep reform in Malta. So in that sense, how this affects how we operate every day, journalists continue to be isolated, harassed, hit by lawsuits, threatened by SLAPPs, generally ignored by those in power. And I'm referring here to investigative journalists, because the media landscape in Malta is distorted in itself because of the domination of ownership by political parties. And the government can continue to ignore the investigations that individual journalists carry out at great personal risk, because it controls the media landscape. It controls the public sphere. It controls the public broadcaster that has become nothing more than a propaganda machine for the party in government. In addition to that, it has unleashed a climate on social media where dissidents, where legitimate critics of the government are identified, targeted, harassed. That is then in addition propagated on the party's media channels, where different programmers identify the people involved, and this leads this take it back to social media and leads to a whole cycle of hate against individuals who dare to voice their concerns, who dare to speak out against what is being done by the party in government. There is, of course, progress in the sense that thanks to the civil society movement that was created in the aftermath of Daphne Caruana Galizia's death, then the Prime Minister at the time, Joseph Muscat, was forced to leave his post, then again replaced by a person he chose. And so the rhetoric changed, but in essence, no real reforms have happened. At this point, I think every independent newsroom in the country has been hit by the threat of SLAPP lawsuits. This is, these are lawsuits that newsrooms in Malta cannot possibly even dream of defending. So we have had to find our way, and thanks to the international press organizations that help us to scream out loud, to talk about what is happening, to expose their tactics, to force to increase pressure on the necessary authorities in the European Commission to address the very real and very dangerous situations that each journalist faces in the country.
Thank you, Caroline. Rebecca, if you could continue.
Sure. So I'll add my view from the side of the international campaign for justice. So maybe just to put this into perspective, we campaign in cases of impunity constantly all around the world. Over the past decade, more than 1,000 journalists have been killed in the line of duty or in connection with their work, the vast majority of these cases with full or partial impunity. So the progress that has been achieved in this case is really remarkable. I mean, everything that has been achieved so far should have been impossible until it wasn't. So I would say to date, this has been one of the most successful examples of a campaign that we've been involved in. And there's a few reasons for that. Perhaps we can unpick it a bit in the discussion. But just maybe for those who aren't as familiar with the specifics of the case, we're now in a situation where 7 men have been arraigned in connection with the murder, including an alleged mastermind, Jorgen Fennick, including middlemen and including the hitman. And a landmark public inquiry has concluded into the circumstances surrounding Daphne's assassination. That inquiry in and of itself was a hard-won campaigning victory. The former administration of then Prime Minister Joseph Muscat fought this at every step of the way until it finally worked. And that was really due to concerted advocacy, particularly at the Council of Europe, and efforts really to push the Maltese authorities along until it became essential that they comply. And even then, it was at the very, very last stages of a deadline that had been set by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. After more negotiations about the composition of the Board of Inquiry, an independent board was established, and it conducted its work thoroughly, robustly, independently. At Reporters Without Borders, we welcomed this work. We testified to the public inquiry. We worked jointly with a big group of international NGOs as well to issue a written submission to it, and we have scrutinized the work of this board throughout. Now, the report was published at the end of July, and the findings have been really excellent, including recommendations about next steps, not just in Daphne's case, but to ensure better protection of journalists going forward, because that was always one of the purposes of this inquiry, was to ensure that that those still working in Malta could do so safely, because as Caroline mentioned, there are risks that continue. So we're now at a stage where if the recommendations are properly implemented, Malta could possibly be a role model for other countries in how to respond to such a case. So this is a really crucial moment. I was part of a joint mission of press freedom organizations that traveled to Malta just 2 weeks ago for the 4-year anniversary. And we met with Prime Minister Abela as well as other officials in Malta. We raised these concerns directly with him and have really pressed upon him the need now for the commission of experts that is needed to be properly independent and for it to reflect the expertise needed to ensure that the public inquiry recommendations can be properly implemented. So again, this is a crucial moment and one that could see Malta serve as a positive model rather than just a negative example of all of the reasons that this was allowed to happen. So we are at a crucial moment. And I think that it's worth mentioning as well that there's an election coming up in the country. Election periods can be really difficult for media freedom, especially in a very divided media climate like we see in Malta. So one thing as international NGOs that we asked the Prime Minister when we met him was for his assurances that his political party media would not engage in attacks on media during the election period. And he said, I give you my word. So this is something that we will hold Robert Abela to. And just to turn just for a moment to the broader press freedom situation. So Caroline touched upon it as a journalist who is working under serious risk still. Of course, what happened to Daphne did not happen in a vacuum. Further reforms are needed, not just those that are identified in the public inquiry report, but so many expert bodies now that have looked at the situation in Malta in the intervening years. None of these recommendations have really been properly implemented apart from the public inquiry itself. So we're still in a situation where, in particular, we need to see greater checks and balances on the office of the Prime Minister. This is something that almost everybody involved has pointed out. From Reporters Without Borders side, I want to mention that Malta has fallen 34 places down our World Press Freedom Index in the years since Daphne was assassinated, which shows really the broader climatic issues. And as we raised with the Prime Minister just 2 weeks ago, our conclusion at present is that the climate has not changed sufficiently to where this could not happen again. At the moment, I would have to say that what happened to Daphne could happen to other journalists still in Malta, and that is an alarming state of affairs. Caroline mentioned as well that that Prime Minister Abela is still the face of the same party, that it hasn't marked a real change in that regard. I want to note that although some things on the surface have become slightly easier, every journalist that we speak to in Malta tells me that it is more difficult now to get information from Robert Abela's administration, that even routine requests are delayed or never acquiesced. So it's becoming more difficult, not just for investigative reporters, but even for those just reporting the news day to day in Malta. If you're not in a certain crowd of political party media, it is really difficult to do your job in Malta still to this day. So there's many other issues in the climate, but I'd say one reason that we stick with the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia is to ensure that other journalists still working in Malta are able to do so more safely, and that there will be reforms to the climate in Malta itself, but B, because of the emblematic qualities that this case has and that Malta has now taken on, because we know now more because of the light that has been shed on the situation in Malta. We all know more about SLAPPs, for example, and this has really changed how we all work on free expression, throughout Europe and internationally, in fact. So we stick with this case because we believe that if we achieve justice in any of these cases, that it will have a knock-on impact and help actively protect journalists everywhere going forward. So those who may wish to use violence to silence critical voices, as happened to Daphne, even looking at the effectiveness of the campaign for justice so far, will hopefully be deterred. And hopefully, again, this will have active protections for journalists. So I will leave it at that, and very happy to discuss any of those points further.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And finally, Keelan, last but not least.
Thank you so much, Lana, and thanks very much to both organisations for organising today. Well, we've heard very powerfully from Paul about the real impact of what my client Maria Ressa in the Philippines calls lawfare, so the weaponisation of law against journalists, so that the law itself becomes a tool of harassment. And we've seen how that happened with Daphne, and indeed Caroline's described so powerfully how that still is happening to her 4 years on. People getting threatening letters from respectable firms, many would say, and well-regarded international firms, sending letters which are threatening and which are attempting to chill journalists from doing their job and from speaking truth to power. And it's very powerful to hear from you, Caroline, in the eye of the storm at the moment. And in many ways, it's very depressing that what you're describing is so similar in many ways to what happened in 2016, 2017, after the Panama Papers, when there was an initial expectation that prosecutions would follow and investigations would follow. But actually, it was business as normal. And then Daphne was one of the key people who got targeted for speaking out about what was happening. Rebecca, a few minutes ago, I'm in The Hague, in the glamorous setting of the Novotel, The Hague at the moment. I'm not in a forest. And I was just speaking a few minutes ago to Paul's brother, Matthew, who was just commenting on how incredibly powerful it's been to have Rebecca from RSF, but also Tom Gibson from CPJ and Sarah Clark going to Malta year in, year out. And he described you, Rebecca, as the X-Men of the campaign. So I'm not sure who fits what character, but I quite liked it. So I wanted to let you know. I just wanted to flag three things just quickly before we move to Q&A. The first is, as everyone has heard, it's now been 3 months since the end of July, since the independent public inquiry published its very detailed report, 437 pages, finding that the Maltese state should shoulder responsibility for Daphne's death. Now, what that report says is precisely what Paul and his family were saying in winter 2017, and they were being insulted for it and treated as enemies of the state. It's precisely what his lawyers were saying, his international lawyers at that time, and they were being called neo-colonialists, which is quite an interesting description of an Irish person. But all of those things, which Paul, you said the very first time we met 4 years ago, are now endorsed, and they are now in that report, that 437-page report. And the report, for those of you who haven't seen it, concludes that a culture of impunity was created from the highest echelons of power within Malta. And former Prime Minister Joseph Muscat was singled out and identified as enabling this culture of impunity, and his entire cabinet was found to be collectively responsible for their inaction in the lead up to the assassination. Now, that report is damning, but many of you who join us today will not have read it. It has not been translated fully into English. It has not been translated into Russian or into other languages. And that in itself, it seems to me, is very damning, because the Maltese state did not make arrangements for that report to be translated. Translations which you've seen have been produced by the family and the family's legal team and NGOs and journalists. So instead of shining a light on these issues, what instead we see even now is an attempt to shy away from those very damning findings. And we're obviously a long way from the recommendations in that report yet being implemented. The second thing that I just wanted to point out is about the culture of impunity at the time in Malta. People often think about impunity in the sense of criminal responsibility or criminal liability. And it's very important that we actually have a broader conception of impunity, and we recognize that things like having a system which enables journalists to be subject to criminal defamation, to be financially crippled for doing their job, all of those things are also part of a culture of impunity. It's not just about criminal liability for perpetrators, it's a much broader concept. And what we see in that recent report is that Malta had entirely failed to take protective steps to protect Daphne from known risks to her life. And also, they had failed to facilitate the state having an enabling environment in which journalism should thrive. And that's the standard set by the Council of Europe. It's a standard which Malta failed dismally in 2017. And I'm afraid, as we've heard from Caroline and Paul and Rebecca, it still fails it now. And what is needed is root and branch political and legislative reform. Finally, when we think about impunity, I do think it's important that we think about the role of the international community. It seems to me fitting that some of you are joining us from London and I'm joining you from The Hague. We're joining from around the world and not necessarily in Malta, because many of those threatening letters, the legal letters which bombarded Daphne in the last weeks and months and years of her life and that Caroline has to face, come from firms that are based in the UK and based in other countries. And while that climate of impunity was festering in Malta, the world was standing idly by and doing very little. And it seems to me a key thing we should discuss this evening is what you can do when you have a situation as you had in Malta in 2017, and it was known. Daphne was writing about it on her blog. Caroline, you've been writing about it for many years. And the world turned a blind eye to that culture of impunity which was going on, and then behaved as if shocked when Daphne lost her life in 2017. And it seems to me that it is high time that the international community now holds Malta to account, holds Malta to every single one of those recommendations in that report, and ensures that we cannot have a situation happening to Caroline or to any other journalist like what Daphne was put through previously. It seems to me it's long past time for states who claim to believe in the importance of freedom of expression. The UK, Council of Europe member states, EU member states, even the Media Freedom Coalition to act. They failed Daphne then, they failed Paul and his family then, they failed the Maltese people then, and now it is high time for them to hold Malta to account and ensure that the change which Daphne's family and Malta need and deserve comes to pass. Thank you.
Thank you for that impassioned speech, Keelan. We'll turn to Q&A in a moment, and I would like to start off with my own question to Keelan, actually. I'm not letting you go so easily. Going back to the topic of SLAPPs, I've definitely noticed that there is a lot of confusion amongst the general public about this term, and we need the support of the public in order to battle this. So my question for those who don't entirely understand what SLAPP means, how come a British, a UK-based law firm file a lawsuit against, let's say, a Maltese journalist and pretty much destroy their lives from a COSI office in London, for those who don't know?
Well, Lana, it's a really good question. The first one is about the terminology. I don't like the term SLAPP. It stands for, it's an acronym which stands for a strategic lawsuit against public participation. And it made particular sense where it originated in the US, but it doesn't mean anything. And I know I'm a lawyer, so it's a bit rich to say, don't use acronyms. But SLAPP is something which, or anti-SLAPP is something which means something to those of us who already understand the concept. But actually, it's not a term which necessarily speaks to the general public. So I do think that's a really important point about using terminology that's meaningful so people understand it. In terms of what it involves is people sending threatening legal letters which have no proper legal basis in order to try to silence people. So it's a strategic attempt to try to use the law to gag people. Now, unfortunately, when you're dealing with media organizations which do not have deep pockets, or individual freelancers, or people who frankly are not as brave journalists as Caroline or Daphne or Paul or Matthew, people are cowed by that. And they receive the letter and it's terrifying. And what they do is, even if their story is still good, there's no proper legal basis for the letter, they just pull it. They don't report because it's too frightening and too concerning for them to do it. And in my view, lawyers who send letters like that, which have no proper legal basis, are not complying with their professional obligations. And this is a very dull recommendation, but an important one. I think we should be working together to see if we can get regulatory bodies for lawyers to bring in means of disciplining lawyers who send empty letters which are an abuse of their professional position. Now, it's not without precedent. There's a recent example involving lawyers who signed clients up to, or individuals up to, what are called NDAs, another acronym, so non-disclosure agreements, when they were women who'd been abused. And in fact, unfortunately, as you'll know from the Me Too movement, there were many women who were forced to sign up to NDAs, to agreements which prevented them even speaking to a counsellor about their sexual abuse, for example. And it's now been recognised that lawyers who are party or privy to those kind of agreements can be held to account because it's a breach of their professional obligations. And it seems to me that we should be working in order to tackle SLAPPs, or whatever we want to call them, that's a more understandable term. We should be working to tackle the lawyers who send those meaningless letters and who try to weaponize the law against journalists like Caroline and journalists like Daphne.
Very well said, Keelan. Thank you for such an extended answer. And we'll jump to other people's questions as well. I'll just pick a few. And the way it's going to work is that, well, unless there's a specific question to a specific person, I think, you know, whoever wants to pick it up, we can just start this way. And the one that jumped at me right away was from anonymous attendee. What evidence is there that the international authorities are actually getting involved rather than hoping this will go away? So whoever would like to begin. Paul,
I mean,
perhaps.
Sure. Are we talking in relation to my mother's case, or?
Well, they didn't specify, but I assume it's related to your mother's case.
So the kind of one advantage we had with Malta, it has to be said, is that it was small, so international relations really matter to it. And so leverage, you know, from international, supranational bodies like the Council of Europe, the European Union, was really powerful. So they were bodies that couldn't be ignored in the same way, for example, that Russia ignores the Council of Europe all too often. On a more practical basis, international involvement was essential in a number of important ways. So, for example, it was only thanks to a specialized team of FBI agents that we were able to track down the hitman, who in turn led to the middleman, and so on. That speaks to very useful international help, but also to really serious problems domestically. So my mother's car bombing was the first where that kind of analysis was applied, and was in fact the first car bombing where the executioners were established. The other important body was, of course, Europol, which helped in the ongoing criminal proceedings in a number of important ways. I think what my brothers and I realized over the campaign is very early on that because Malta's institutions were so totally compromised by our own government, we had to immediately start looking outside for help. It was a strange exercise in a way, because we often met people who didn't realize how powerful and helpful they could be, and often met people who showed us what could be done. So the public inquiry is in a way a perfect example of that. Like Rebecca said, it was one of these things that seemed impossible until it wasn't, and came to us almost, or not almost, really by chance. And the kind of mechanism that forced it into place was, at the end of the day, a recommendation from a special rapporteur that the Council of Europe assigned to my mother's case after we ran around the Council of Europe building for days.
And I think the next question is kind of in a similar line as well. It's from John Bovis. Over more than 50 years of knowing Malta and its governance, I can remember the days when the time of Malta printing works were burned down, but never the murder of a journalist with government involvement, at least in the cover-up. Could election monitors from EU and NGOs oversee the election and freedom of speech? Has the European Court of Human Rights been approached, and the international jurist? Cannot the European Commission be required to investigate good governance in Malta? Perhaps it's a good one for Keelan. I might be wrong.
I think it would be better hearing from Caroline or Paul first on that.
Perhaps Caroline. Yeah.
Could I be a bit disruptive and just say one very quick thing on the last question, just to add? I completely agree with what Paul said, but it's also a good lesson, I think, on when you're dealing with a Council of Europe country and where you're dealing with an EU country, you have mechanisms available to hold the state to account if they don't do the right thing, in a way that sometimes we don't have in some of our other cases. But it was a really creative use by the family and by wonderful work by the NGOs. And I'm very honored to have been a part of it, working with those brilliant people on not relying solely on the European Court of Human Rights. Because if we'd gone to the European Court of Human Rights to say Malta has failed, it would have taken many years. The investigative trail would have been cold, and we would have got a ruling saying Malta failed. And actually, right from the first day that I met Paul, they were very clear, Paul and his brothers were very clear that they wanted action as soon as possible. And using the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe was a really creative way to do that. And I've just actually met Peter Omtzigt this evening, the rapporteur, and the role he played individually cannot be underestimated. So often in these kind of fights, getting the right people lined up and using the tools you have at your disposal, that's a key thing. So here, using the political mechanisms of the Council of Europe was a much faster way. We always had the threat of going to court, but actually Parliamentary Assembly and the rapporteur, they were really key to getting those results.
Thank you, Keelan. And the next question is for Rebecca. We've heard about legal threats against Daphne and other Maltese journalists being facilitated by UK law firms. What should the UK government be doing about this, particularly given it is spearheading the Global Media Freedom Coalition?
Well, I think the question maybe is more about like, what is it about the climate here in London that allows that to proliferate from here? And I know we're involved in various coalitions of NGOs working together on anti-SLAPP measures, and there are some legal provisions that could be introduced that could be protection in that regard. I really liked Keelan's suggestion about pursuing this from a professional perspective to actually hold the lawyers to account who are facilitating this. From my campaigning perspective, I think as well, greater action to name and shame the lawyers and the law firms that are doing this, because very often the public here is not even aware of the ramifications of these London law firms in other parts of the world. It's not just Malta. We see examples in many other countries. And as you mentioned, Lana, it can destroy somebody's life actually to receive such a threat. So, you know, we work on other practical measures too, trying to inform not just the public but journalists themselves about these types of threats and what people can do if they find themselves receiving this, because sometimes even just receiving a letter marked private and confidential with this intimidating letterhead, you don't know what to do, but actually you can do with it whatever you like. Maybe I could put Caroline on the spot to pick this up too. I've been really always impressed with how she's responded. She has published every single threatening letter that she and the shift have ever gotten, and if I'm not mistaken, so far she has called the bluff every time, so those cases haven't escalated further. Of course, sometimes people are prepared to actually litigate if they're making these threats, but very often even calling their bluff could be effective. So I think Caroline has been particularly courageous on the ground in a climate where SLAPP threats have often been effective in the past, which is one reason that journalists like Daphne were left exposed when you're continuing to be critical about issues that systematically everyone around you is being silenced. So I think one lesson that can be drawn is the need for solidarity among media, the need to speak out about these things, to shed light on them, and everybody is safer if there are courageous voices that are willing to do that.
And I think building on that question, there's another one for Keelan that she'll be able to answer perhaps. What is the discussion, if any, in the wider legal community in UK about law firms sending threatening legal letters? Do lawyers see this as damaging to the reputation of the legal profession itself, or is there a lack of awareness outside of those directly involved?
Yeah, so my view is there is a lack of awareness outside those directly involved. There are some really good media lawyers who are concerned about this issue. So say Gillian Phillips, who's the in-house senior lawyer for The Guardian, for Guardian News and Media, has been concerned about this for some time. She also works with the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom. So there's people like her who've been very concerned. So many of us who work in the space are concerned about it. But I think Rebecca's idea of naming and shaming is a really good one. And I have to say I was pleased to hear Paul name Mishkondareya earlier, because I've often been at events where people talk about London firms and don't name them. And actually, you know, Mishkondareya sent many of those letters to Daphne before her death. And the letters, when you read them, are legally incoherent. There wasn't a proper basis for them. And they were sent simply as a tool to try to silence her, to keep her quiet, to chill her journalism. And lawyers who do that must be held to account. I think it's a really good idea from the questioner, the idea of getting wider awareness amongst the legal community, because actually that worked quite well on the NDA Me Too issue. So perhaps that's an action point for us all to take forward after this evening. So thank you to the person who asked the question.
Thank you, Keelan. And actually, my next question is Caroline's. Is for Caroline, because Shift News really picked up where all the cases that Daphne left, and I was just wondering, can you walk me through some of your latest investigations that you've been pursuing that got you and your colleagues in trouble, just to let our viewers know that, you know, you're still carrying on the work?
Yes, but I set up the Shift 3 weeks after Daphne's assassination because I believe that it was very important to send a message back to the perpetrators that you can't do this to one of us, and to make sure that the stories that she was not allowed to finish would continue to be investigated. We have now a term that is being repeated today, especially the Day Against Impunity, that, you know, you can't silence the story, even if you could a journalist. So that has been our mission for the last 4 years. But to build up on what's been happening with SLAPP, we were hit by the threat of a SLAPP lawsuit only 3 weeks after we set up. and the threat was so immense. It was a very early choice we had to make, whether to fight back or to just shut down, because you can't even afford to, as a small newsroom, or even any newsroom in Malta, in fact, you can't afford even the legal fees to put up a proper defense. So we really at that point said, you know, we have nothing to lose at this point. So this threatening letter that you get, which is with big bold letters at the top in caps, saying this is not for publication, and several threats that if you do publish, we said, if we're going to go down, we go down telling people why. And that move we made helped other newsrooms in Malta understand what was going on. We learned also, and the public learned what was happening, because several newsrooms in Malta had already received such threats and had just withdrawn the stories without even informing the public. So it's Orwellian in the sense that, you know, it is the alteration of the record, of the public record. So we have continued to do this, and this has been our tactic, and other newsrooms now have adopted that tactic. And obviously we get hit by these kind of threats, because the stories that Daphne was investigating crossed borders. So we weren't dealing about, you know, local politics anymore. This one's corrupt, that one's corrupt, that one has, you know, bought these votes, or you know, there's nepotism here or cronyism there. This was real cross-border corruption, money laundering, serious issues involving huge companies. One of the investigations, for example, we have pursued together with investigative journalists, because I must say that we would not have been able to pursue all that we've been doing without the support of international journalists and newsrooms. So one of them, for example, is the energy deal that we even traced all the way to Montenegro. We have exposed, excuse me, corruption there. The hospitals deal. That again, 3 public hospitals given away, and now we have discovered that the company itself is going to court to contest a 5 million court case to say, you know, they themselves are saying this is corrupt, this is fraudulent. So it's a mess, and the mess has been exposed by journalists. The problem that we have is, and this was pointed out in the public inquiry, the problem that we have is that when investigative journalists reveal all this information, the law enforcement authorities do not act. And even in the very few cases where this does end up in court, the process, the system is just, the processes are just bogged down in, it's inadequate, there is no accountability, you know, there are scapegoats that are charged, but the real people responsible are never brought to justice, which is why, again, I mentioned at the very beginning, the Council of Europe's statement today that said, that spoke about the need for deep reform in Malta, because without a proper holistic approach to address the problems with the rule of law in the country, there's not going to be a solution to this.
And just building on what you said, I think the most horrifying conclusion is that journalists have to often pick between censorship and financial ruin, and that's a choice that no journalist should make. Going back to the inquiry, because there are a couple of questions about that, there is a question that I think Paul and perhaps Caroline would be able to answer, and whoever wants to, you guys just jump in. Is there any hope for Malta to implement the recommendations in the public inquiry, and what steps have been taken, if any, so far? Which recommendations should be prioritized?
Caroline, do you want to go first, or should I? Okay. Well, on steps taken, the answer is none. And the sad thing is, it's turning into yet another campaign. So we always suspected this would happen, but it is still disappointing that, you know, you get a report like that, And rather than the government snapping into action in a way that's obvious, in appointing an independent, non-partisan committee of experts to make the implementation, it turned out to be yet another part of our campaigning. Whether there's any hope for the recommendations to be implemented, again, I'll just point to what Rebecca said earlier, that everything seems impossible until it isn't. And I mean, I sure as hell didn't spend 3 almost years campaigning for a public inquiry for it to not be implemented. So it will be a focus of our efforts.
Caroline?
If I can add on to what Paul is saying, first of all, it's really important to note that the findings of the public inquiry are a world first. It was only possible, I mean, the government fought this all the way for 2 years. It was only possible because of the struggle of the family and international organizations and lawyers such as Keelan who helped push this through. So as Paul said, there is no way that we are going to accept that the findings of the public inquiry are going to, gather dust in a drawer. There's no way. So this is now going to become another campaign. I am often asked whether I'm a campaigner or a journalist. And I often say the same answer. We don't have a choice because we cannot do our work without pushing those boundaries that we need to be able to perform our duty as journalists. There's a point that Rebecca said earlier that in their meetings with the Prime Minister that they had a conversation that an election is coming up and the Prime Minister committed to, we're not going to target journalists before an election. I mean, the fact that you even have to say that is a sign of the situation that we have to work in. And by the way, that does not include activists, does not include other dissidents who are not necessarily journalists and who are continuing to be targeted. So clearly, it's ground zero still for us. But thanks to the support that we've received for this campaign, that we have this really, it's a groundbreaking confirmation of first of all the role that propaganda played in her assassination, and of fundamental reforms that are needed in any democracy for journalists to be able to do their job. And this is really a blueprint. So one commitment we can certainly make is that we're going to make sure that we will do our best for this to be implemented, because it's not only important for Malta, it's important for Europe, it's important for the rest of the world, because democracy is as strong as its weakest link.
Very well said, Caroline. I absolutely agree with you. And I think that Rebecca mentioned at the beginning that this case, this campaign for justice is a success, despite its drawbacks. That's why I wanted to ask Rebecca, I mean, you've been campaigning for so many years and you've met so many journalists and families of murdered journalists. And what do you think this campaign for justice means to them? Did you manage to talk about journalists from other countries and their families who've been following this case closely? I mean, what does it mean to them?
Absolutely. And one of the most touching parts of this work is when we see families that we support in other cases mobilizing on some of our other cases. And so I think the progress that has been made in the campaign for Daphne has indeed been encouraging to others. And I know Daphne's sons and her other family members have been personally very supportive on other campaigns as well. I think that's extremely inspiring to all of us to see. I just wanted to pick up on some of the points that Caroline made, and just to emphasize one thing is that the international side of the campaign remains so important, because the progress that has been made has only been when there's intense international scrutiny of every step. And at every point when it appears that there has been made progress, if that international attention fades, then it's almost a question of one step forward, two steps back. So it's incredibly important that we sustain this attention, that we ensure that our own governments continue to engage with their Maltese counterparts, that we hold these international bodies to account and spurring them on to make sure that their own reports, their own recommendations are actually implemented in Malta. Because every time headlines fade and every time attention shifts to something else, I think the authorities in Malta are acutely aware of that. So it's incredibly labor intensive for everybody involved. The reason that we've made the progress that we have is because of the combination of efforts of Daphne's family on the ground, their legal team, journalists and activists on the ground in Malta, and the international side of it. And I include campaigns like ours, but also the investigative journalism that has continued from abroad, for example, through the Daphne Project. All of those things have come together. This has taken thousands and thousands of man hours to even achieve this. But again, it should have been impossible. We are actually getting somewhere. And I fully believe that if we do that, we can see justice served for Daphne. And when we talk about justice, we talk about full justice. There's a lot of focus on the public inquiry now, and rightly so, and those recommendations have to be implemented. But it's also very important to sustain attention to the criminal justice proceedings that are ongoing. We have not yet seen anyone brought to trial, and we will certainly at Reporters Without Borders continue to scrutinize that process and try to do what we can to ensure international attention remains on that as well.
And I think Keelan wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, thank you. This is such an interesting discussion. It was 3 quick points. The first one is Caroline used that phrase earlier, that killing a journalist must not kill the story. And that's really important for the story to still be told. But it also has a protective element for journalists, because if you know that if you kill a journalist, that is going to make the story go away, that's a real incentive for the kind of people, the powerful, whose toes are being trodden on by this work that Caroline, Paul, Matthew and Daphne have undertaken. So it is also very protective, and it's why projects like the Forbidden Stories Project, or I've got a prop, the CPJ, the Last Column book, and also collaborative journalism projects where multiple journalists and media organizations work together are so important in themselves, but also as a protective mechanism. Second thing is, I agree completely with what Paul and Caroline said about how disappointing the response to the report so far has been. To be honest, it's been a fight at every stage over the last 4 years. I mean, within hours of Daphne's death, Paul, I know you and your family were having to fight over whether the appointed magistrate should recuse themselves because of their previous involvement in Daphne's reporting. We then had to fight for a year to remove the senior police officer. So, I mean, these are not fights that you should have to have as a bereaved family. But I'm afraid with a kind of a slight weariness, but a real steel, because I know this is a fight that we will win. Unfortunately, it seems we have another fight on our hands now. But I think we're all ready, including the X-Men of the campaign, to fight that fight. And the final thing I just wanted to say is, I mentioned Maria Ressa earlier, who's one of my clients, and she's one of the 2 brave journalists who's been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think the 10th of December, when she and Dmitry from Russia are due to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, is a really important moment, because this was a strategic decision, it seems to me, by the Norwegian Nobel Committee. I know, Rebecca, you've used that phrase too, to highlight the importance of journalism and the importance of journalism as a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. So the world on the 10th of December will be paying particular attention to the plight of investigative journalists who are targeted for their work. So that is a very, very good time to make noise, it seems to me, and to try to get this change and to win the latest stage of this fight. I've no doubt we'll win it at some point. I'd like to win it by the 10th of December.
Thank you, Keelan. And Paul also wanted to add something.
Sure. At the risk of sounding a bit sentimental, but really just to pay tribute to most of the people on this call and talk about how the public inquiry came about. So we first met Keelan, my brothers and I first met Keelan at a Reporters Without Borders event. So Rebecca asked us to speak to her board, which at the time included Keelan, who, after we spoke, rushed up to us really like a hurricane and said, please, let me help you. And when you're in that in that state, you do everything. You know, you ask everyone for help, you speak to everyone who listened to you. And we really didn't know what to expect or what to ask for. And we certainly didn't know a public inquiry was ever possible, although, you know, it should have been triggered automatically under our laws. And when I look back on it, I think how close we were not to getting one, you know, because we didn't even know it was possible. And only just because Matthew met Rebecca asked us to speak at this event where Keelan was present, that it all came about. And one of the things we really hope is like Caroline has said, it's a blueprint, that it's something that now shouldn't feel unlikely or difficult, but should just happen, and happen at least in a similar way, without all the campaigning and the struggling, is what we hope. And we should, by the way, have a translation into English quite soon. And I really hope that people read it and see what went into it, but also the depths to which Malta fell over the past 10-ish years.
It was absolutely extraordinary to learn that you actually were responsible for the translation of this inquiry. So I've read about this inquiry, but I haven't seen that actually the government hasn't provided the official translation. And we have another question that I think Caroline and Paul can answer. How hopeful are you for the future of media freedom in Malta? What is it like for young journalists there?
If there wasn't hope, we wouldn't be fighting. The situation is difficult, but the cause is so important that it is worth the fight. I join Paul in thanking people, Keelan and Rebecca Vincent and the other organizations that have shed light on Malta and given attention to the cause. As I said, when I set up the shift, it was supposed to be a project. It was never my intention to set up a newsroom in Malta. The idea was to tie the cause for justice for Daphne with the need for media press reform in the country. The media landscape in Malta is distorted. There is no way this is going to be solved as long as the political parties in the country continue to dominate ownership of the media. So it is another campaign, another fight that we need to push forward, because the idea of what an independent media really means in the country is not even clear. So this is not going to be a short battle. It is going to be a long-term campaign. So the shift is there to stay for as long as the community continues to support the cause and international organizations continue to highlight the situation in Malta. It's been 4 years, several people arrested, no trials commenced, there is no justice, there is no convictions. So we're in this for the long haul, and hopefully, until we achieve full justice for Daphne Caruana Galizia, we can hopefully create some real reform for the media situation in the country.
That was very moving, Caroline. I think we're all trying not to tear up here. It's an incredibly emotional discussion. And Paul, I just discovered recently that you're actually working on a book about your mother and your fight for justice. It's called In the Name of the Mother, Daphne's Sons and Quest for Justice. I'm so excited to read it. What's it about, and when can we finally get our hands on it?
I don't know. I don't know about the second part of your question. It's proved to be a real job. I think it's mostly there. And it's about the past 4 years, it's about, you know, how our family has changed, what my mother went through. So it tells her story, and after her murder, moves into the campaign. And I think it's important to say that you know, everything in the book is written, you know, to pay tribute to her, but to show people how bad things can get when corruption takes hold of a country, what it takes to wrestle it back, and I hope it will be out soon, because it may give people some hope. And I wrote it to support the foundation Matthew is running in Malta. So all proceeds go to the foundation. In fact, my brothers told me we should do it. We can all write it together. But in typical youngest brother fashion, I got lumped with it for the past 2 years. But I think it's mostly there.
Yeah, and you guys are all writers, so all three of you. So it must be challenging, but also, you know, at least you know what you're doing. And someone's asking in the Q&A about the link, the best available link to the report. I guess that's the public inquiry. Where would our viewers be able to read it? Maybe we can link it to them.
So the translation into English, when we have it checked, will be on our foundation website. So Daphne.foundation. And I'd really encourage people to visit the website and see what we're doing, what we've been doing.
Yeah, we actually have a question about that, Paul. Could you tell us more about your incredible foundation and where it's at 4 years on?
Okay, well, that's really kind. So we set it up in 2018 to you know, take ownership of my mother's work, but primarily to ensure full justice for her. So her murder, but also all the stories she was reporting on. There are other aims of the foundation, which Matthew is managing at the moment, which speak to Malta's longer term, deep-rooted issues. So, for example, organizing training for journalists, building tools that will allow journalists in Malta to collaborate on projects, a public interest litigation network, which allows people to fight cases that are in the public interest. So it, in a word, attempts to lead by example in claiming a civic society space for Malta and forcing the political parties which really have strangled public life in Malta away. So it's incredibly funded by advertising revenue from magazines my mother founded and edited, which my incredible aunt Cora has managed to keep running over the past 4 years, and through grants from international organizations, and one day from this book, I hope. But I'd really encourage people to check out its work and see what Matthew's been up to, who, by the way, is running it as a full-time job.
Yeah, I second that. Make sure to check out the Daphne Caruana Galizia website. And Keelan, we're actually going back to the question of evil lawyers who are in London. We actually have another one by London lawyers sending inaccurate but intimidating in content and letterhead letters to the corrupt who can pay for them is morally equivalent to selling guns to such people. Hope the Law Society and others could give this publicity in the law legal community. Any hope of that?
Yeah, so on that, I think, again, like the question earlier, this is a really good point. And I think there are a number of us who've been concerned about this for some time, but I think it's time for a concerted campaign to see if, in fact, we can crack down in a regulatory way on lawyers who are not complying with their professional obligations. And that's what many of these letters are. The other aspect I should mention is Paul mentioned earlier that some of the letters that were received by Daphne were about her blog running commentary in Malta, but they emanated from London. And there is a real fundamental problem with London still being perceived by many as the libel capital of the world. And I'll put a link in the chat in a moment, but there was a attempt a number of years ago by an Azerbaijani MP to intimidate the OCCRP and Paul Radu into taking down a story. And it wasn't just saber rattling in a letter. He did actually go ahead with suing them. And a number of my colleagues, led by Jonathan Price, who's also one of the lawyers who acts for Paul's family, represented them. And they caved only at the last minute, just before the case was due to be on. Now, it was a very big risk for Paul Radu and OCCRP to decide that they were going to run a whole hearing. It was due to be, I think, a 2-week hearing in London, with costs running into tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds. So that's the kind of money that you need to have to see down some of these threats. And it seems to me, we as lawyers in London, those of us who are lawyers in London, should be ashamed that London is being used in that way. And I think it's time we did something about it. The reason I put my hand up was I just wanted to say really quickly, Paul mentioned there that Matthew is now campaigning full-time on this issue, so has stopped working as a journalist full-time. Paul has moved from being an academic to being an absolutely brilliant journalist at Tortoise, and any of you who've not read his work or heard his podcast, please do. But not every family who have a journalist who dies because of their job have got sons who are as brilliant as Paul and Matthew and Andrew, and campaigners like Rebecca and others, and journalists like Caroline in their corner. And I've spent today with some really amazing people, including Paul's brother Matthew, but also Hatice, Jamal Khashoggi's fiance, and others who've lost their loved ones. And it is simply not fair for the onus to be on bereaved families to drop their jobs, campaign full-time, to try to get states like Malta to do what they should have done all along. It's not acceptable. And it is beyond time, it seems to me, for states and the international community to stop putting the onus on bereaved families like the Caruana Galizia family, or like Hatice for Jamal Khashoggi. It is not reasonable for the onus to be on the people who have suffered the most to do this. States should be stepping up, the international community should be stepping up, and we shouldn't be in a position where we have to rely on someone like Matthew campaigning full-time and setting up a foundation to fill a gap, which shouldn't have been a gap in the first place.
Very well put, Keelan. But nonetheless, if any of our listeners want to support the foundation and Shift News also, that's actually is able to do its work through public donations, please, I would like to encourage you to do so. Once we're done, please go to the Shift News website and to the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation website, and if you can support them, that would be fantastic. And I feel like we could really talk forever. It's just such a powerful discussion that we're having, but at some point we'll have to wrap it up. And I think that perhaps each of the speakers could talk about what can be done. What are the next steps towards media freedom in Malta? I mean, I know we can't always end on a positive note as much as we want to, but perhaps there's something we can do internationally and locally also. Maybe we can start with Caroline.
I think we've been discussing Malta as one case among many since the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the murder of Jan Kuciak. More journalists have been killed in the Netherlands, in Greece. And yes, the Nobel Peace Prize is an important moment for us. It is important recognition, first of all, of the work such journalists have done so brilliantly. Others harassed and maimed, whose names are never even mentioned. So it is an important recognition of the work that such journalists have done so brilliantly. And while it may be too late for some, it is important that no single life is lost in vain. It is important that we try to turn something so negative into something positive. And if we can all at least acknowledge the need for reform and support the efforts of different individuals in different countries to push the cause for press freedom forward and the cause for democracy, you know, the importance of the right to know, the right for justice, all of these measures are extremely important, and any recognition of that is valuable, and we're grateful for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And Paul, perhaps you have some thoughts on that also.
So I mean, in a technical sense, the implementation of the public inquiries, consideration and then implementation of the public inquiries recommendation, I think in a broader, longer term sense, it's been really encouraging to see the growth of civic society in Malta, perhaps the most encouraging thing we've seen over the past 4 years. And I hope more and more we'll see people in Malta consider that journalists are really on their side, that journalists work in the public interest. And it seems amazing that somehow over the years that got lost. And another thing is something Caroline has alluded to, the completely distorted media landscape in Malta. So television station, radio stations, newspapers owned by political parties, and accounting for most of the market. And I think a situation in which people sharing a little country, but because of the media they consume, inhabiting totally different worlds, is unsustainable and explains a lot of the problems we've had to deal with.
Thank you, Matthew. Sorry, Paul.
That happens a lot.
Oh, I'm sorry. And Rebecca, would you like to add something as well?
Sure. Well, I guess just to echo everything that Caroline and Paul said, and to add a couple of very practical things from my side. I mean, here in the UK, something that's always helpful is to write to your policymakers, keep this alive, keep the discussions alive in the UK Parliament, and prod our MPs to prod our government along as well, because I think the Maltese government is particularly sensitive to its reputation here in London and its relationship with the UK government. So that always helps. A very practical suggestion: support those that are fighting this fight financially. The foundation, I believe, takes donations as well. The Shift News needs funding. They are fiercely independent, and I say fiercely because we know Caroline and the Shift very well as an RSF partner organization. In fact, they're the only media outlet in Malta that did not take government subsidies during the pandemic, so they need support. And all of our organizations at the international level who are involved in this campaign were all nonprofits as well. Most of us do not have specific projects in place to support this campaigning, which again has been sustained effort for years now. So if you're able to, donations are very gratefully received, and I'd say first and foremost priority those on the ground. And just another note, possibly a bit of an announcement, sorry Lana if you were going to go there, but just to mention the UK anti-SLAPP work. So RSF is part of a coalition that both of the organizers of tonight's event are involved in as well, the Justice for Journalists Foundation, the Foreign Policy Centre, a UK anti-SLAPP coalition that is open to others to join as well, and also to journalists who find themselves facing these threats. If you need support in the UK, our organizations can usually find a way to help. So please come to us. There's an excellent report as well that has come out, a policy paper on this that maybe we can link to in the chat where everybody can see. And there will be a big anti-SLAPP conference here in London from the 23rd to 24th November that many of us are involved in. So for those who want to learn more, there are lots of resources out there.
And Keelan, perhaps you'd like to.
Yeah. So I agree entirely with everything that's been said, including Paul's kind of technical points about what should happen in his case, and then the broader issues. And one of the things that's been really encouraging on the civil society front has been the strategic litigation initiative, Paul, that the foundation have started, which is really impressive and is about holding power to account in other ways in Malta. So I would say, as well as donating, if you can, to the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation and to the Shift News, and also if you're able to, indeed, to RSF, which is also fighting on a shoestring budget and doing a pretty amazing job and punching above its weight, as well as doing those things, just very practical steps. Number one, follow Paul, Matthew, Andrew, and the foundation, and Caroline and Rebecca on Twitter. Follow what they're doing. That's a good place just to watch out when there's particular actions to take. So do that. And number two, if you're horrified by what you've heard this evening and you want to show support and you want to ask Malta why they are not implementing the recommendations yet and what the delay is, if you're based in London, as many of you tonight are, why don't you write to the Embassy of Malta in London to ask? Say you're a concerned citizen in London, you want to know. So that would be a step you could take. And also, Rebecca mentioned writing to your MP or to your parliamentarian. If you're in the UK or in any Council of Europe state, you should check as well the people who are your national members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, because that's the body which has been so effective in holding Malta to account. So it's worth tracking them down too and writing to them. And final thing I just wanted to say was journalists step on some pretty powerful toes in their line of work. And too often those in power, be they in Malta, be they in Russia, be they in the UK, have little incentive to investigate, let alone pursue justice when you have a tragedy like this. And it is up to us to hold them to account and make sure that they do and hold their feet to the fire. Paul's had to do that for 4 years since losing his mother. It's not a fight he should have had to have, but now that he's having it, we all need to support him as much as we possibly can.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been such a powerful discussion, and I would like to personally thank all of you, and Paul especially and his family, for pursuing justice for his mother. And I just want to add from myself how inspiring it is and how it fills me and many others with hope. I can't imagine, I can't imagine coincidentally what it feels like. I know that you had to sacrifice so much for this campaign, and we're all very grateful to you, and we'll do everything in our power to support your efforts. And just to all of our viewers, if you want to hear more about what we've been discussing, if you want to hear more about Daphne and the way journalists from all over the world are being persecuted and receiving legal threats, please do join our conference. Start registering even today. The link is in the chat. I would like to again thank everyone for joining us today, our viewers and our participants as well. It's been such an honor sharing this panel with you, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.